Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. It had been a perfect day for camping. Clear skies, a warm sun, and the scent of pine filling the air. We were out in the national forest, not too far from the nearest town, but far enough to feel the peace and quiet that only nature can give. The ground was soft underfoot, the trees towering above, and the only sounds were the calls of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. My friends and I were all excited for the weekend away from everything, to enjoy a few days of hiking, campfires, and laughter. We arrived at our campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip low in the sky. The site was perfect, open, flat, and surrounded by thick forest on all sides. We quickly set up camp, each of us claiming a tent and unloading our gear from the cars. There was no one else around, just us and the wilderness. By the time we finished setting up, the sun had sunk below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle above. The air had cooled, and we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. It was one of those rare nights where everything felt right. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the night sky, and we chatted about everything and nothing. But then, as the night wore on, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. One of my friends, Sam, pointed out a car down the road, parked on a shoulder. It was a dusty old station wagon, one of those vintage models that looked like it hadn't seen a wash in years. The headlights were off, and it wasn't parked in any spot. It was just sitting there, facing our campsite. It wasn't unusual for cars to pass through the area on their way to the nearby trailhead, but this car, it didn't seem to fit. At first, we didn't think much of it. People sometimes drive down to remote campsites, especially in a national forest. Maybe someone was lost or pulling over for a quick break. But the more we looked at the car, the stranger it seemed. It was parked in a weird spot, far enough down the road that it didn't make sense for someone to park there unless they were deliberately choosing to stop. We all kept an eye on it, tried to shake the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Every time I glanced over, the car was still there, just sitting, no movement, just waiting. The fire crackled louder as the night deepened, and we all tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over us. We joked about it, laughed it off, but something about that old car just didn't sit right. I couldn't help but stare at it now and then, trying to figure out if I was imagining things. But no, it was definitely still there. I didn't want to be the one to bring it up, but I could feel the same unease spreading to the others. They kept glancing at the car too, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the air felt colder. The fire had started to die down, and we all sat around it in silence, listening to the occasional snap of wood burning. That's when we all heard it, an engine starting up in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another car passing by, maybe someone heading back to the highway. But the sound was too close, too deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a car speeding off. No, it was much slower, as if someone was in no hurry. The old station wagon's headlights flickered on, casting an eerie glow across the trees. The car started moving slowly and then began to creep up the road toward us. My heart started racing. The sound of the tires crunching against the gravel was unnervingly loud in the silence of the night. I don't know why, but it felt like the world had gone still around us. It was as though every living thing had frozen, and the only thing moving was that damn station wagon. It didn't seem right. There was no reason for it to be coming closer to our camp, and yet it was. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The car came closer, slowly, moving right behind our cars, but it didn't stop. It just idled there, right in the middle of the road, behind our cars, its engine rumbling softly, as though the driver was waiting for something. 5 minutes passed. The sound of the engine was the only thing I could hear. It was so loud in the quiet night that it felt like it was coming from inside my head. My skin was prickling and my mouth was dry. I glanced at my friends, but no one moved. Everyone was frozen, staring at the same thing I was. I wanted to call out, to ask what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like something was wrong, so deeply wrong, that even breathing too loudly might provoke whatever was out there. The fire seemed to be flickering low now, as though it too was unnerved by the strange presence just outside our camp. The car sat there for what felt like an eternity, its headlights shining down the road and casting long shadows across the trees. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each thump sounding louder than the last. My thoughts raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation for what was happening. But none came. It wasn't a person looking for a place to camp. It wasn't a ranger. The car finally started to move again. It didn't speed up, though. It slowly turned around, its tires crunching on the gravel. And then, just as quietly as it had arrived, it drove off into the night. The engine sounded distant now, but still I could hear it, slow and deliberate, moving farther down the road. The sound grew quieter and quieter until it was gone completely. The silence that followed was deafening. None of us spoke for a long while, the tension hanging thick in the air. We all sat frozen, staring at the spot where the car had been. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but I couldn't come up with anything. No logical explanation made sense. We tried to pretend like everything was fine, but the truth was that none of us could shake the feeling that something had just happened that we couldn't explain. The fire had all but died now, and the night seemed unnaturally quiet. I glanced at the others, but no one made a move to stand or speak. The weight of the silence pressed down on us all, and we just sat there, eyes darting to the trees around us, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. It wasn't until well after 1 o'clock that we even thought about trying to sleep. The car's disappearance didn't make us feel safe. In fact, it made the whole night feel even more unnerving. It was like something had been watching us, testing us, and then just left. But why? We eventually crawled into our tents, but sleep didn't come easy. Every noise in the dark made me jump. Branches creaking in the wind, the call of an owl, the rustle of something in the underbrush. I kept my flashlight beside me, my eyes darting to the opening of the tent, expecting to see the headlights of that station wagon shining through at any moment. But nothing came. By morning, the car was gone. The sun had risen, and the woods were quiet once more. We packed up our gear, still on edge, as if we were afraid the same strange car would return. But it didn't. We left the campsite without saying much, the weight of the previous night lingering in the back of our minds. We didn't talk about the car much after that. It was as if bringing it up would make it real, like speaking about it would somehow make whatever had happened more terrifying. But the truth was, none of us ever forgot that night. We all knew something strange had happened, something we couldn't explain, and that feeling stayed with us long after we left the forest. Even now, years later, I still think about that station wagon. The way it moved so slowly, the way it waited, and the way, when it was gone, everything felt wrong. The woods never felt the same to me again, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to shake that feeling of being watched. I was deep in the Sierra Nevada, at one of those backcountry sites that takes a full day's hike to reach. No cell service, no road noise, just the high alpine air and the constant hum of nature. It was early September, late enough in the season that the nights dropped cold, but early enough that snow hadn't come in yet. I had set up camp in a clearing just above a small lake. I remember it well. Crisp blue water, granite ridges towering on every side, and golden light filtering through the trees as I cooked dinner on my tiny stove. I'd hiked about 12 miles that day, and by nightfall I was worn out in that good way that only comes from real effort. I sat on my folding camp chair while I ate just some dehydrated chili mac and hot tea, nothing fancy. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I watched the pinks and purples of the sky fade out. The wind died with the light, and the forest grew still. I put on my down jacket and sat in silence a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one. I must have stayed in that chair until just after 10, just sitting and breathing and listening. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt perfect. The world was quiet, and I was where I needed to be. Eventually, I packed up, brushed my teeth, and stashed the food and toiletries in my bear canister, then tucked it away down the slope about 100 feet from camp behind some boulders. I double-checked my perimeter, no wrappers or scraps, and crawled into the tent. I remember the coolness of the sleeping bag when I first got in, how the down settled around me. I kept my headlamp near my pillow and my boots just inside the vestibule. The chair was folded out near the fire ring, not far from the front of my tent. I didn't fall asleep right away. I was tired, but my mind was still moving, running through memories of the trail, thinking about the ridgeline I'd be climbing tomorrow. I could hear the soft chitter of something small, maybe a pika or a chipmunk, off in the distance. Then silence. For a long time, there was just the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. The kind of quiet that isn't really quiet because the forest is always doing something. I must have drifted off somewhere around 11. The kind of sleep that feels like falling into a deep, cold lake. No dreams, just blackness. Then I heard the chair. It was subtle at first, just the tiniest creak, like when you first sit down and the fabric stretches a little, but no weight was really on it yet. I opened my eyes. My tent was still, the fabric around the vestibule gently rising and falling with my breath. I waited. Nothing. Just the same faint noises of the forest. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe the fabric of the chair shifting from the cold, or a squirrel messing around. But I didn't hear any scurrying. I listened harder. Another creak, this time unmistakable. Slower, like someone leaning back just a little. It was the unmistakable sound of that chair moving. I froze. My eyes were open now, staring at the ceiling of the tent. I didn't move for a full minute, maybe more. My ears strained for anything. Footsteps, a sniff, a breath, but nothing came. Just that soft, rhythmic sound of the chair slowly rocking. It creaked again, and again, slowly, like someone was sitting there, calmly swaying back and forth. I finally sat up, heart starting to thud in my chest. I reached quietly for the headlamp and clicked it on, keeping it pointed at the floor of the tent to avoid lighting myself up like a beacon. I pulled on my boots without tying them. My knife was in the pack next to me, but I didn't go for it. I wasn't thinking weapons yet. I was still telling myself maybe it was a deer or even the wind. But the air outside was dead still. I knew that. I unzipped the inner flap of the tent, then the vestibule, trying to be quick but quiet. When I finally stepped out, my light immediately hit the chair. It was rocking, just slightly, back and forth. The legs tapped the dirt gently each time it tipped. There was nothing in it. No person, no animal. I swept the light around in a wide arc, nothing. The fire ring was undisturbed. No footprints in the dust around the chair. The trees around the site loomed tall and still, casting long shadows in the beam of my headlamp. I turned the light off. I wanted to hear. Silence. Then a rustle. Not close, maybe 20 yards off, down near the slope that led to the bear can. I froze again, my ears reaching into the dark. Another rustle, then silence. Could have been a deer, I thought, or a raccoon. But raccoons don't rock chairs. And deer don't usually come that close to people unless you've been feeding them, which I hadn't. My food was sealed and stored, not a scrap left out. I turned the light back on and walked slowly around the campsite, scanning every direction. The woods were empty. No glowing eyes, no animal shapes. The air was cold on my face, and I could feel the stillness deep in my bones. I walked over to the chair, placed a hand on it. Still warm. The fabric wasn't warm like a person had been there, but it wasn't cold like it had sat untouched in the night either. My fingers trembled a little as I checked the legs. No signs of pressure, no prints beneath it. The only tracks were mine from earlier that evening. I turned in a slow circle, checking the tree line again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but there was nothing to see. Just towering pines and smooth stone and darkness. After a full sweep of the area, I made a decision. I picked up the chair, folded it, and locked it tight. Then I shoved it under the vestibule of the tent with me, just to get out of sight. I zipped everything shut and sat inside the tent for a long time, just listening. I didn't climb back into the sleeping bag for over an hour. Eventually, I did fall asleep, but it was a light sleep. Every little noise outside made my body tense. Once or twice I thought I heard movement in the brush, but it was too soft to be sure. No more creaking, just occasional rustles and the deep, eerie silence between them. At first light, I got up and packed camp faster than I ever had before. I checked the area again, carefully this time, now that I had full visibility. I didn't see anything unusual. No prints, no signs of a person or a large animal. My bear was untouched. Everything was exactly where it should have been. I hiked out, glancing back over my shoulder more than once. I didn't stop for water until I was 3 miles down the trail and well below the ridgeline. I didn't feel safe until I could hear distant traffic on the road leading into the trailhead. For days, I kept turning it over in my mind. There's no good explanation. The chair didn't just move on its own. It wasn't windy, and nothing else in camp shifted or fell over. I didn't hallucinate it. I was wide awake when I saw it rocking, but there was nothing there. Best I can figure, someone was out there with me. Maybe a transient, someone living rough in the backcountry, moving quiet and careful. Maybe they were just passing through and got curious when they saw my camp. Maybe they sat in the chair while I slept, just for a minute. Maybe they were watching me, or maybe they were waiting for something. That's what gets me, the not knowing. Whoever it was, they didn't take anything. They didn't make a sound. They didn't show themselves. But they were close enough to sit in my chair, close enough to touch my gear, close enough to watch me sleep. It shook me up more than I expected. I've been camping alone for years. I'm used to wildlife, to storms, to tough terrain and long nights. But that night in that silent forest, knowing someone had been so close without me hearing a thing, it changed something. I still camp alone sometimes, but I never leave gear out anymore. I keep everything packed tight, and I sleep lighter. I burn a motion alarm when I remember. I always place my back to a rock wall if I can. I mark the perimeter with a headlamp beam and memorize it before I zip up for the night. And every time I sit in my camp chair now, I think about that creak, that slow, deliberate rocking in the dark. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. Or worse, if I had stepped out just 1 minute sooner. If I had caught them in the act. If they hadn't wanted to be seen. Because whoever it was, they were quiet, careful, patient, and they were watching. I don't know what made me venture off the trail that day. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, casting the whole forest in shades of orange and purple. I was solo hiking in the backcountry of Washington, a few miles north of Mount Rainier, feeling pretty good about myself. I've been on the trail for 3 days, taking my time, soaking in the silence. I had my pack, my gear, and a sense of peace that you only get from being out in the wilderness, away from everything. But that peace didn't last. There's something about being alone in the woods for a while that starts to mess with your mind. You start noticing things that aren't there, sounds that don't belong. But I hadn't expected anything like this. It was the smell that hit me first. A sour, rotting stench, like meat gone bad. It wasn't strong, just faint, but enough to make my stomach turn. I stopped and sniffed the air, trying to place it. I was at the edge of a dense thicket, a place where I had just passed a small creek. The ground was wet, the trail soft, and the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I looked around, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. In the distance, about 20 yards away, a tarp was strung between 2 large cedar trees. At first, I thought it was just someone's shelter, maybe a hiker who had set up camp. But something about it felt off. The tarp was stretched tight, not the kind of shelter you'd set up for a short stop. It was permanent, or at least it looked that way. A patchwork of different colored tarps and blankets had been sewn together, but the edges were frayed and dirty, as if they had been there for years. It wasn't like any shelter I had seen before, especially not in the backcountry. Curiosity got the better of me, and against my better judgment, I made my way toward it. The closer I got, the more details I could see. The tarp wasn't just a shelter, it was a home of sorts. I could see blankets piled on the ground, some of them so old that they looked like they had been there for months. There were half-eaten cans of food, most of them rotting and covered in flies. Knives had been driven into the stumps of nearby trees, the blades gleaming dully in the dimming light. They weren't tools I recognized, just rusty, grimy knives that had been hammered into the bark, as if to stake a claim or mark territory. I stopped a few feet away, trying to get a better look. There was something else, something that made my skin crawl. A small wooden box sat in the corner of the shelter, open, and inside, I could see what looked like a journal. I was about to walk over to it when I saw the cover. It wasn't a journal in the normal sense. The pages inside weren't filled with writing. Instead, there were strange symbols, lines and squiggles that made no sense, almost like something out of a fever dream. They weren't random either. It looked intentional, but there was no way to figure out what they meant. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I had no idea who had been living here, but the whole setup felt wrong. It felt like something that had been built with purpose, but not by anyone who was living a normal life. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had just stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I knew I needed to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shelter. It wasn't just a place that felt off, it was the air around it, thick with tension, like the forest was holding its breath. I slowly turned around to leave, but that's when I heard it. The sound was faint at first, almost inaudible over the rustling of the trees. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like something heavy stepping on soft ground. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was coming from behind me. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but the more I focused, the more I realized that it was getting closer. The ground was wet, so I couldn't hear footsteps, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was walking around my camp. I was alone. The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. There shouldn't be anyone out here this far from the trail. The forest was too thick for anyone to be out here without making noise. But there was again, slow, heavy breathing, the kind that sounds too deep to be human. I took a few steps back, trying to get a better look, but the darkness was closing in fast. The sound stopped for a moment, and I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought. Maybe it was nothing. But then it started again. The breathing, low and steady, circling my camp. I didn't dare move, too afraid that if I made a sound, I'd give myself away. I stood there, frozen, listening. It felt like it was toying with me, walking around the perimeter of my campsite and then stopping, only to start again in another direction. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. The breathing never stopped, just circled around me like some kind of predator, closing in without ever getting too close. I could feel it watching me, even though I couldn't see anything. Finally, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I grabbed my pack and quietly started to back away, keeping my eyes on the dark shapes around me. Every step felt like it might be my last. The breathing followed, still keeping its distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't want to risk it. I didn't run, but I moved quickly, not daring to look back. The entire forest felt alive with something I couldn't see, something I couldn't understand. I didn't want to know what it was. By the time I made it back to the main trail, the sun had long since set, and the light was fading fast. I didn't stop to set up camp, didn't take a breath. I just kept walking fast with my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the breathing faded behind me, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't shake it. It felt like the forest itself had eyes that were still tracking me, even as I left. I didn't report what I had found. I didn't tell anyone about the shelter or the knives or the journal with the symbols. I didn't even tell anyone about the thing that had circled my camp. Part of me felt like it wasn't my place to tell. Maybe it was someone else's territory out there. Maybe someone's place that had been forgotten by time. But part of me also knew that if I told anyone, they'd think I was crazy. And I couldn't take that chance. I still don't know what was out there. I don't know who had been living in that shelter or why it felt so wrong. I don't know if what I heard was an animal or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in that empty, silent forest, and I'll never go back to that spot. No matter what, I never want to find out what else is hiding out there in the woods. In 2016, my girlfriend and I went on a weekend camping trip to the Catskills. We were both living in the city at the time, Brooklyn, so we were down to get away from the noise, the constant buzz, the traffic, everything. She had just finished a rough week at her job, and I'd been working double shifts. We needed the mountains. We left early on a Friday morning, packed up our gear the night before. Basic stuff: two-person tent, down bags, a small stove, freeze-dried meals, headlamps, a water filter, first aid kit. We were both experienced hikers and campers. I'd grown up in upstate New York and spent a lot of time outdoors. She was originally from Colorado and knew her way around wilderness too. We weren't amateurs. We parked at a quiet trailhead near Slide Mountain. There were no other vehicles there when we arrived, and it was already close to noon. It was a bit odd since it was a perfect September day. Clear skies, cool air, the trees just started to turn. Still, we didn't mind the solitude. That was the point. We hiked in about 5 or 6 miles, took our time. The trail followed a ridge line for a while, and then dropped down into a shallow valley with a stream cutting through it. That's where we decided to camp. It was flat, a little overgrown with ferns, but with just enough space for our tent. The creek was maybe 30 feet from where we pitched camp, shallow and clear, tumbling over rocks, making that peaceful white noise that helps you sleep. We spent the rest of the day filtering water, cooking a simple meal, and walking a little farther up the trail without our packs. We didn't see a single person. No boot tracks, no voices in the distance, no wrappers on the ground, nothing. That night, we sat by the creek, drank some hot tea, and just listened. It was quiet in a way the city never is. Total darkness. No planes overhead, no sirens, no headlights on distant roads. Just wind moving through the trees and the water trickling by. We went to bed around 10, maybe a little later. The tent was just wide enough for us to lie shoulder to shoulder. She fell asleep almost immediately. I laid there for a while, eyes open, watching the shape of the rainfly move gently in the breeze. I could hear the occasional creak of the trees as they shifted, but nothing unusual. Eventually, I drifted off. At some point, I woke up. It was still dark, pitch black. I rolled over and checked my watch. 3:12 a.m. I remember the exact time. The reason I woke up was the sound. At first, it didn't make sense. It wasn't loud, just faint, but strange. It sounded like kids playing, that high-pitched giggling, bare feet running through wet leaves and across rocks. Fast, light footsteps, splashing, little splashes like someone hopping from stone to stone in the creek. I laid there completely still, eyes wide, listening. I thought maybe I was dreaming at first. That hazy line between dreaming and waking where your mind plays tricks. But I was awake, completely awake. I nudged my girlfriend gently. She stirred but didn't open her eyes. I didn't push it. I didn't want to panic her. I kept listening. The sounds didn't go away. The laughter wasn't wild or scary. It sounded like actual kids, maybe 6 or 7 years old. It was playful, but that's what made it wrong. We were miles from the nearest road. We hadn't seen another soul all day. There was no one camping nearby, no cabins, no towns close enough to explain it. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 short bursts. The noise went on like a game was being played, hide and seek or tag. You'd hear quick footsteps dash behind the tent, then giggling from the other side of the creek. Then silence. Then another splash, another laugh. I slowly sat up. I didn't unzip the tent right away. I wanted to be absolutely sure I was hearing what I thought I was. I reached for my headlamp, but didn't turn it on. I knew the beam would give away our exact location. Not that we were hiding, but I suddenly felt like I didn't want whoever was out there to know we were watching. The moment I touched the zipper and slowly started to open it, the sound stopped. All of it. Not a single footstep. No splashing. No laughter. Just dead silence. It was so sudden it made my skin crawl. I unzipped the rainfly halfway and looked out. The moon was low but bright enough to see the outline of the trees and the silver surface of the creek. There was nothing there. No movement. No figures. I leaned out further, scanned the woods around our tent. Still nothing. I slipped out of the tent as quietly as I could. The ground was cold under my feet. I didn't put on shoes. Just stood there in my socks, holding my breath, ears straining. I looked for tracks in the soft dirt around the tent. Nothing. The creek ran calmly. There were no ripples or signs anyone had stepped in it recently. The ferns near our tent hadn't been trampled. Nothing looked disturbed. I stood out there for maybe 5 minutes. I felt like I was being watched. Not in a paranoid way. Just that creepy feeling you get sometimes, like eyes are on you and you can't prove it. My girlfriend shifted in the tent, and I went back in, zipped it up again, and lay down. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just laid there staring at the roof of the tent. When morning came, we got up and made coffee. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to color her experience or make her think I was messing with her. But she looked at me and said, "You were up last night. I heard you get out. Was something wrong?" I hesitated, then told her everything. She went quiet and listened all the way through. Then she said she hadn't heard anything, but she'd had a strange dream that she couldn't remember clearly. Something about children laughing. She didn't know if she had really heard it or just dreamed it, but the timing matched. We checked around the tent again in the daylight. Still no signs of people, no small footprints, no trash, no disturbed earth. We even walked a little up and downstream, just to check. The forest was quiet again, peaceful even. It didn't make any sense. We stayed one more night. Part of me didn't want to, but neither of us really believed it was anything to be scared of. We told ourselves it was probably animals, foxes or coyotes or raccoons. But none of that explained the laughter, or how it sounded so much like kids. That second night was quiet, not a single unusual sound. We packed up in the morning and hiked back to the car. Still no other vehicles at the trailhead. We drove back to the city in silence for the first hour, both of us lost in thought. I didn't bring it up again for weeks. Months later, I was talking to a guy I knew through work. He was older, maybe mid-60s, used to hunt all through the Catskills in the 80s and 90s. I casually asked him if he ever camped near Slide Mountain. He said yeah, a few times. I asked if he ever heard anything weird. He looked at me for a long moment and said, yeah, but nothing I ever could explain. Then he changed the subject. I've been back to the Catskills since then, camped in other areas, but I've never returned to that exact spot. I looked at it on the map once, trying to pin down where we were. It's just a patch of forest. No history of missing people, no known campsites, no ghost stories attached to it. Just woods and water. I still think about it sometimes. I try to break it down logically. Could the sounds have been carried from far away by the wind? Could have been some small animal that just sounded like kids? Could someone have been out there messing with us? Maybe, but then why no tracks, no gear, no lights, no evidence at all? It's the only time I've ever felt something was off in the woods that I couldn't explain. Not supernatural, just off. Like we brushed up against something we weren't supposed to witness. Something wild and ancient and indifferent to whether we believed in it or not. It didn't follow us. Nothing bad happened. We made it home fine. But that night is burned into my memory. More than any bear encounter. More than any whiteout storm or near miss. Because it didn't make sense. And I still have no explanation that feels right. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. And the second I looked, it vanished. That part still gives me chills. Not the laughter, not the splashing, just that sudden, perfect silence. Like whatever was there had been watching us the whole time, and didn't want to be caught. It was supposed to be just another quiet night camping in northern Arizona. The sun had set hours ago, and the sky was clear with a scattering of stars that seemed to glitter from above like 1,000 eyes watching over me. I had hiked in earlier that day, far off the beaten path, to find a secluded spot that felt as remote as I could manage. The air was crisp, cool enough to make the fleece jacket I wore feel like a relief, but not cold enough to make me uncomfortable. I liked it here. I'd set up camp beside a narrow, dry creek bed that ran through the valley, surrounded by the dense pines and scrub brush that seemed to go on for miles. There was no one else around for miles. The only sounds were the occasional creak of a tree as the wind moved through them, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of some nocturnal animal that I couldn't quite place. It was peaceful, and that's what I was after, just a few days of solitude, away from the noise of city life. I made dinner, a quick freeze-dried meal, and then sat by the fire, watching the embers slowly fade to glowing coals. After a while, the fire had burned down enough that I could no longer justify sitting there, so I crawled into the tent. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, feeling the warm fabric pull me into its comforting embrace. For a while, everything was fine. I could hear the faint rustle of the trees outside, and occasionally the chirp of a cricket or the sound of a twig snapping under the weight of an animal. But then, as I was lying there in the dark, just starting to drift off to sleep, I heard something else. It was a whisper, low but distinct, coming from outside the tent. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it first, but then it came again, soft, almost like a voice, but not quite clear enough to make out any words. It wasn't the wind. The wind had its own rhythm, a kind of steady rustling, but this was different. It was rhythmic like a chant, repeating itself over and over again. Every few seconds, it would start again, just loud enough for me to hear it clearly through the fabric of the tent. I froze. At first, I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe a breeze pushing through some leaves or the rustling of a critter in the underbrush. But the sound, the pattern, didn't match anything I'd ever heard in the woods before. It was too deliberate. I stayed still, listening harder, trying to make sense of it. The chant was the same each time, the same cadence, like a whispering voice circling the tent, never growing louder or quieter, never more distant. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, almost like it was designed to draw you in. It must have gone on for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it could have only been a few minutes. My mind raced. I considered all the possibilities. Maybe there was someone else out there. Maybe another camper was out in the woods, doing something weird or creepy. Maybe there was some kind of animal making a strange sound. But then again, I didn't know of any animal in this area that could produce a sound like that. And as far as I knew, I was the only one in these woods for miles around. I was starting to get a little anxious. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid. There was no reason to be afraid. I had camped in places far more isolated than this and had never experienced anything remotely like this. The whispering stopped suddenly, cutting off in mid-chant. The abrupt silence that followed was almost worse than the sound itself. My heart started to pound in my chest, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any other sound that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals, just pure cold silence. I waited. A few seconds stretched into minutes, but nothing happened. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The air around me felt thick, heavy with tension. I was starting to feel uneasy, not just about the noise, but the sheer weight of the quiet that followed. It felt like I was waiting for something I couldn't see or understand. It took everything I had to force myself out of the tent. But I had to. I couldn't stay in there anymore, lying still, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Something deep inside of me wanted to know what was out there, even if I didn't want to find it. I unzipped the door slowly, trying not to make a sound, and poked my head out. The night was still. The campfire had long since died, leaving behind only faintly glowing embers, casting soft shadows on the ground. The trees loomed around me like dark sentinels, their branches moving gently in the wind. But there was no whispering, no sounds at all. I stepped out of the tent, feeling the cold ground under my boots. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to make out any movement, any shape that wasn't supposed to be there. There was nothing, no one. I stood there for a long time, just listening, trying to make sense of it all. I half expected to hear the whispering again, but it didn't come. Not then. The only thing I could hear was the occasional snap of a twig from the woods and the wind whispering through the pines. Eventually, I made my way around the perimeter of the camp, walking the same path that I had taken earlier when I set up. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone being here but me. No strange disturbances in the dirt or anything that could explain the sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. That sensation crept up on me slowly, like a shadow slipping just out of view. It wasn't paranoia, it felt real. As if there was something out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. But still, there was nothing. Just the woods. Just the darkness. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my nerves. I reminded myself that this was just my mind running wild. The dark, isolated places of the world have a way of playing tricks on you. I was just spooked. I had to shake it off. So, after a few more minutes of scanning the area, I returned to the campfire pit and sat down. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish, that there was nothing to be afraid of. The silence around me was different now. It wasn't oppressive or heavy. It was just the normal quiet of the woods at night. It was peaceful. I crawled back into the tent, zipped up the door, and tried to settle in. I laid there for what felt like an eternity, but the whispering never came back. It was as though the forest had returned to its usual rhythm, the occasional breeze making the trees sway, the distant calls of night animals echoing through the valley. Eventually, I fell asleep. It was a fitful sleep, but I slept. The strange whispering never came back. The next morning, I woke up to the bright sunlight streaming through the trees, and the camp felt normal again. Just another peaceful day in the woods. I packed up my things, leaving no trace behind, and started my hike out of the valley. As I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. The whispering, the unease, the strange sensation of being watched. But there were no answers, no signs, just a quiet. I never did figure out what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the isolation, the eerie quiet of the desert night, messing with my perception. But something told me that I'd never really be sure. I left the valley that day and continued my hike, but the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just out of sight, stayed with me for the rest of the trip. It didn't change anything. I still loved the wilderness, still found peace in the isolation. But every time I set up camp in the woods after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really. I had been on the road for a few days, just moving through the desert with no real destination. I like the quiet of the desert at night. It's clean, it's dry, and when the sun goes down, the whole world seems to hold its breath. That evening, I pulled off a dirt road outside of Tonopah. I knew from my map that there was some dispersed camping allowed out there, Bureau of Land Management land. No one around for miles most of the time. I had a GPS unit and some downloaded topo maps, and I'd marked a flat spot a few miles out that looked good for camping. It was remote, and I figured I'd get there just after dark. I didn't mind hiking in at night. Sometimes I preferred it. The air cools down and the stars come out. And if you're careful, it's peaceful in a way daytime never is. I parked my car to pull off near the road, threw on my pack, and started the hike in. It was just past 8 p.m. when I started walking. The light was fading, but there was still enough to see the trail at first. The path wasn't well defined, just a vague impression in the dirt from past hikers or maybe ranchers, but I had the route loaded on my GPS. As the night came down, I switched on my headlamp and kept a steady pace. My boots scuffed along the rocky dirt, and every now and then I had to slow down to pick my way across loose stone or a dry wash. About an hour in, I paused for water and checked my position. I was about a mile from the spot I'd planned to camp at. It was so quiet out there. No wind, no bugs, no animals that I could hear. Just my breathing, my footsteps, and the crunch of my boots on dirt. Then, as I rounded a shallow ridge, I noticed something strange ahead. A faint orange glow, flickering low over a rise, maybe half a mile away. At first, I thought it might be the moon rising, or maybe a headlamp with a red filter. But as I moved a little closer, I realized it was a fire. A real one. Campfire-sized, steady and bright. It was where I'd planned to camp. That was odd. I hadn't seen another car when I parked, and I'd picked that spot precisely because it was far enough from the road that most people wouldn't bother with it. I figured someone else had gotten there before me. Not a big deal. It's public land. I could share space if I had to, or pick another spot nearby. Still, I didn't want to surprise anyone, especially at night. People could be jumpy out in the dark. So I slowed my pace and switched my headlamp to its lowest setting, shielding it with my hand. I moved up the ridge carefully, using the rocks and brush as cover, not to hide, just to be respectful. I didn't want to walk right up on someone in the dark. When I got to the top of the ridge, I crouched behind a large boulder and looked down. That's when I saw them. 5 people standing around the fire. Not sitting, not cooking, not talking. Just standing. Each one perfectly still, facing the flames. The fire wasn't big, just a small controlled burn of mesquite and deadfall. Enough to cast long shadows out across the rocky ground. But the shadows didn't move. The people didn't move. I watched for maybe a full minute, waiting for someone to adjust their stance, shift their weight, scratch an itch. Nothing. They weren't close together, either. They were spaced evenly around the fire, like points on a circle. Arms at their sides, head straight ahead, like statues. I couldn't make out much detail, just outlines and posture. But from the way they stood, it looked like they were adults. All of them. One looked taller than the others, maybe a man, but I couldn't tell. No one had a flashlight. No tents. No coolers. No chairs. Just those 5 figures and the fire between them. A strange feeling settled into my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a tightening. Like my body knew something was wrong before my mind could name it. I stayed low and watched longer than I probably should have. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes total. And not once did any of them so much as flinch. No one looked at anyone else. No one looked away from the fire. No one spoke. I remember trying to come up with a reason for what I was seeing. Maybe it was some sort of ritual. Maybe they were on psychedelics and frozen in some weird trance. Maybe it was a memorial. Maybe they'd lost someone and were having a moment of silence. I tried to convince myself it was something that made sense, something that wasn't dangerous. But the longer I stood there watching, the more the unease built. I've been around campfires my whole life. This wasn't right. I slowly backed down from the ridge. I didn't turn my headlamp back on. I moved carefully, checking my GPS by dimming the screen and shielding it with my hand. I could see just enough to follow my own tracks back the way I came. I kept expecting to hear a voice call out or see one of the figures move up the hill toward me. But nothing came. After I was a few hundred yards away, I started moving faster. Not running, but close to it. The night air felt colder. My breathing got louder in my ears. Every rock scrape sounded like footsteps behind me. I hiked that whole 4 miles back to my car with my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I never saw another light out there. Never heard a vehicle. Never heard anything at all, really. Just my own movements and the sound of the desert. When I finally got back to the turnout, I yanked open the car door, threw my pack in the back seat, and slammed it shut. I sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, trying to slow my breathing. The interior was still warm from the afternoon sun. The windshield reflected a faint silver from the stars above. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped sideways into something I shouldn't have seen. I didn't bother setting up camp again. I locked the doors, reclined the seat, and pulled a blanket over myself. I didn't sleep much. My ears kept straining for any sound outside. Sometimes I thought I heard gravel shifting or wind across the dirt, but nothing definite. Just noise in the quiet. I kept my knife on my chest and my boots on all night. When the sun came up, the desert looked exactly the way it always did. Dry, empty, open. I sat up, stretched, and made some instant coffee with my camp stove on the tailgate. I told myself I'd imagined it. Told myself I was tired, maybe spooked by the dark and the shadows. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Later that morning, I checked my maps again. I thought about hiking back to that spot in the daylight, just to see if there was any sign of the people or the fire. But I didn't. I didn't want to see it in the daylight. I didn't want to know what kind of people stand around a fire in total silence all night long without moving once. I drove back to the highway and kept going west. I've camped a lot since then, in forests, deserts, mountains. I've had my share of odd moments, creepy sounds, animal encounters, even some sketchy people. But I've never seen anything like that night in Nevada. I never talk about it around other campers. I don't want to hear what they think it was. I don't want guesses. I don't need explanations. Some things you just leave alone. Some campsites you just let stay empty. I had been planning this solo trip for a while. The idea was simple. Get away from people, find some quiet, and spend a few nights camping in the Rockies before winter fully set in. I figured late fall would give me that perfect balance. Fewer people, still passable trails, and just enough cold to remind me where I was. The trail I picked wasn't too remote, but far enough that I knew I wouldn't hear anyone's generator or car doors slamming in the night. I parked a small pull-off, checked my gear one last time, and started walking in. I'd hiked this area before during summer, but never this late in the season. The first day was mostly uphill, switchbacks winding through bare trees and patches of icy ground where snowmelt had refrozen. The wind had that dry, sharp edge to it, like it had been slicing across miles of empty sky. I saw a few animal tracks, mostly elk and deer, but nothing fresh. I didn't hear birds, no other hikers, just the crunch of my boots, the steady sound of my breath, and the occasional creak of an old pine, tree leaning too far into the wind. I liked that. It felt like I had the whole world to myself. By late afternoon, I found a spot off trail, tucked just below a small ridge, with a flat clearing for the tent and a few large rocks to block the wind. The ground was frozen in spots, soft in others where the sun had hit it just right. I set up camp, made sure everything was staked tight, and gathered what little deadfall I could find for a small fire. The air had that strange stillness to it that happens when the weather is on the edge of turning, like the forest is holding its breath. I kept telling myself it was just the season, animals getting scarce, trees holding on to their last warmth. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. The wind picked up, and I didn't want the smoke drawing attention. Besides, I was tired. I ate a quick dinner from my stove, zipped everything up, and crawled into my sleeping bag. My tent was a reliable one, 4-season, low to the ground, and tight against the wind. I'd camped in worse. I remember lying there, staring at the roof of the tent, hearing the wind tug at the fabric, thinking about how far I was from home. I must have fallen asleep pretty quick. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, not to a sound, but to a feeling. That's what struck me most at first, how quiet everything was. No wind, no creaking trees, just silence, the kind that presses in around you. And then I felt it. The floor of the tent shifted beneath me. Not like the whole thing moved, just a small section, right under where my legs were. It lifted just slightly, like something was underneath it, not pressing from above or outside, but from below. At first, I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes open, body frozen. My first thought was that I was dreaming, that I'd rolled in my sleep and somehow imagined it. But then it happened again, slower this time. A lift, a shift, maybe an inch of movement, enough to feel the air change beneath the floor. I pressed down with my foot. It stopped. I stayed like that, frozen in place, my hand gripping the inside of the sleeping bag. I didn't hear anything. No digging, no breathing, no footsteps. Just that tight silence, like the world had been sucked dry. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe more. I couldn't tell. Time gets weird when you're scared like that. Everything stretches. I kept listening, kept watching the tent walls for shadows or movement, but there was nothing. Then it happened again. This time, closer to my hips. Just a gentle rise. The fabric of the floor pulling up slightly, like a slow breath underneath me. I didn't move. I didn't press down this time. I just lay there, staring into the dark, trying to keep my breathing quiet. I thought about leaving, unzipping the bag, pulling on my boots and running for the trail. But that meant unzipping the tent, getting out into the cold, and not knowing what the hell was under me, or where it might pop up next. I didn't like the idea of stepping onto the ground, not with the way it was acting, so I stayed. For hours. At some point, the cold started to get through the bag, even with the insulation. My shoulders ached from not moving. My jaw hurt from clenching, but I didn't move. Every now and then, I felt another shift. Not regular. Sometimes 10 minutes apart, sometimes longer. Each time it felt a little different. Sometimes farther away, sometimes right under me. Like whatever it was testing, moving around slowly, but not enough to make a sound. When the sky finally started to get light, I didn't wait. I unzipped the bag, grabbed my boots, and slipped them on without tying the laces. I threw open the tent flap and stepped out into the cold morning air. Frost covered the ground in a thin sheet, crunching underfoot. The sun wasn't up yet, but the light was enough to see by. I looked around the clearing first. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of animals. Then I walked around the tent. The side nearest the ridge looked undisturbed. But when I circled to the far side, where the ground sloped slightly down toward the trees, I saw them. Gouges. Long, uneven gouges torn through the frozen topsoil. Not from a shovel or a stick. These weren't clean. The edges were rough, curled up and broken like something had clawed at the earth, trying to get through. There were 4 of them, maybe 2 feet apart, angled slightly toward the center of where my tent had been. I pulled the stakes and moved the tent off the spot. The ground underneath looked worse. The gouges continued, crisscrossing under where I'd been sleeping, some deeper than others. The frozen earth had been dug through in layers, each mark deeper than the last. I could see where something had scraped, pushed, pulled. There were no footprints. Nothing to say what kind of animal, if it was an animal. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't make sense. Nothing I'd ever seen acted like that. No bear would dig like that and then leave. No badger or small predator would come at it from below without making noise. And nothing that burrows would do it so silently, so focused on one spot, my tent. I packed up fast, shoved the gear into my pack, folded the tent without brushing it off, and got moving. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just started walking. The whole way down, I kept looking over my shoulder, listening. Every sound in the woods felt sharp. Every gust of wind felt like something creeping up behind me. I made it to the trailhead by early afternoon. The sun was out by then, but it didn't warm me. I threw the pack in the back of the car and sat behind the wheel for a long time before I started it, trying to make sense of it. Later that night, after I got home and unpacked, I looked up every animal I could think of. Bear, mountain lion, coyote, wolverine, even porcupine. Nothing matched the behavior. No creature I found would dig quietly under a tent, make multiple attempts, and then disappear without a trace. I thought about telling someone. Park services, maybe. But what would I say? That the ground moved under me in the night, and something left claw marks beneath my tent? I knew how it would sound. I barely believed it myself. Still, I haven't been back there. Not to that spot. I've done other hikes since, stayed out in colder places, rougher terrain. But I've never camped in that kind of silence again. Not in late fall, not that deep in the woods. And I don't sleep through the night anymore. I still wake up sometimes in my tent, heart racing, waiting for the floor to lift again. It hasn't. Not yet. But I always check the ground in the morning. Every time, just in case. Because something was there that night. Something moved the earth. Something came looking. And whatever it was smart enough not to be seen, but strong enough to leave marks in frozen ground. I don't know what it wanted, but it knew where I was, and I think it knew I was awake. It was late fall when I set off on my solo hike through the Smoky Mountains. I've been planning this trip for months, a few days of peaceful time away from the world. I'd hiked the trail before, but never alone, and there was something appealing about the solitude. The trail was quiet, just the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves and the occasional call of a bird overhead. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the noise from civilization faded away, until there was nothing but the soft rustling of trees and the wind and the gentle gurgle of the creek. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just a general idea of where I want to camp. As I walked, I kept an eye out for a good spot, flat ground, preferably near a water source. Around dusk, I found a little clearing by a creek that seemed perfect. The creek wasn't deep, but the sound of the water flowing over rocks was soothing, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. I set up my tent and unrolled my sleeping bag, enjoying the simple peace of the place. The air had a crisp chill to it, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. By the time the sun had set, I was wrapped up in my sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire I'd made fading to a low glow. I ate the last of my trail mix, staring into the fire for a while, letting my mind wander. The stars were out in full force, the night sky clear and vast above me. There was something magical about the quiet of the mountains at night, the kind of quiet you can't get in the city. I was alone with the wilderness, and it felt right peaceful. But as I lay in the dark, drifting off to sleep, I started hearing things. At first, it was just the normal sounds of the forest, the wind, the rustling leaves, the occasional animal moving through the underbrush. But then I heard something that didn't quite fit. Footsteps, not the kind of random scurrying of animals, but the heavy, deliberate steps of a person walking along the trail. They weren't fast, but they were steady, slow. My heart rate kicked up as I lay still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my tent. my breath caught in my throat. I held still, trying to keep my mind calm. Maybe it was just a hiker, someone else out here on the trail. But no one had passed me earlier in the day, and I hadn't seen anyone for miles. I lay in the darkness, straining my ears. Nothing. I swallowed hard, trying to reassure myself. It had to be nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind shifting things around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind started to race, my thoughts spiraling with all the worst-case scenarios. Was someone out there? Should I call out? Would it make things worse? I held my breath, listening for any movement, any sound. There was nothing, just the sound of the creek in the distance. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark. The tent walls stretched in the glow, nothing out of the ordinary. No shadow moving, no figure standing outside. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, listening intently. After a minute, I convinced myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, something harmless that was just walking by. But the feeling of unease lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. With a shaky breath, I lay back down and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Just when I thought I might finally drift off, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching softly on the forest floor. I held my breath, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent again. I could almost hear the person's breath, just a foot or so away from me, but there was no sound of movement after that. I wanted to call out, ask who was there, but the words stuck in my throat. If it was a person, I didn't want to alarm them or give away my location. But if it was something else, well, I wasn't sure what to do. I waited a long time, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps didn't come again. Slowly, I gathered the courage to unzip the flap of my tent, just a little, and shine my flashlight out into the darkness. The beam of light swept over the clearing, but there was no one there. No movement, just the trees and the creek, everything still. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I pulled the flap closed and lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But sleep didn't come. My mind kept replaying the footsteps. Whoever, or whatever, had been walking out there hadn't made a sound when they stopped. That wasn't natural. No animal could move so silently. I turned my head, tried to shake the feeling of someone watching me. I told myself it was just paranoia, just the isolation of being out here alone. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet of the night, so loud that it seemed to drown out everything else. Another hour passed, and I had just started to doze off again when the footsteps returned. This time, they were more persistent, like someone was pacing back and forth. My heart skipped a beat as I listened, the sound echoing in my ears. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent again, and for a moment, all was silent. I waited. The air felt thick with tension. What the hell was going on? The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. I turned the flashlight back on, but this time I didn't unzip the tent. I kept it pointed toward the entrance, not daring to look outside. I didn't want to see anything. My mind was racing with thoughts of everything that could go wrong, everything that could be out there. I waited what felt like hours, but there was no more movement. Slowly, my pulse began to calm, my breathing slowing. It had to be my imagination. It had to be. Maybe the sound had just carried differently in the stillness of the night. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to relax. When the footsteps returned for the third time, it was almost a relief. At least I wasn't imagining things. But they didn't stop right outside my tent this time. Instead, they moved away from me, slowly fading into the woods. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. The fact that they had been walking away, did that mean I wasn't the target? Or did it mean they were planning something worse? I lay there, wide awake for hours. The only sound was the creek, gently flowing in the distance. The footsteps didn't return again that night. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I finally fell asleep in the early morning hours. When I woke, it was to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. The forest was alive again, birds singing, the air fresh and cool. I sat up, my mind still foggy from lack of sleep. I couldn't shake the memory of the footsteps, but there was no sign of anyone around. No footprints in the dirt, no disturbed ground, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. I packed up my camp quietly, taking my time, trying to get my bearings. Part of me wanted to get out of there as fast as I could, but another part of me knew that I couldn't leave just because of a few strange sounds. I had to keep going, had to finish what I'd started. So, after a while, I shouldered my pack and started walking back down the trail, the peace of the morning beginning to settle in again. The footsteps seemed like a distant memory, something I would later look back on and try to make sense of. I didn't see anyone else on the trail that day, and I didn't hear any more footsteps, but the feeling stayed with me, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't something I could shake, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I didn't sleep as well for the rest of the trip, always listening, always aware of the sounds around me. But I never heard those footsteps again. Whatever had been out there, it never came back. As I walked out of the Smokies back towards civilization, I thought about what had happened. I didn't know who or what had been out there in the dark, but I knew I'd never forget the sound of those footsteps. And I knew I'd never camp alone in that spot again. I had picked a spot off one of the lesser-used trails in Pisgah National Forest. It was early October, cool enough at night to need a jacket, warm enough during the day to hike without sweating too much. Leaves were just starting to turn, and the forest was nearly empty during the week. That was part of the reason I came. I wanted peace. I wanted to read, sleep, and maybe hike some new miles without bumping into tourists or loud weekend groups. I hiked in just under 3 miles before settling on a quiet little rise tucked above a creek. The creek wasn't huge, but it made a steady sound through the trees, which helped mask the usual nighttime noises I never fully got used to when camping alone. The site had a couple of decent trees for the hammock, some flat space for a small fire, and no obvious signs that anyone had camped there recently. No wrappers, no piles of ash, just pine needles and fallen leaves the way I liked it. By the time I strung up the hammock, collected some wood, and got a small fire going, the sun had already dropped below the ridgeline. I cooked a simple dinner, ramen with some dried mushrooms and jerky torn up into it, while watching the woods shift into darkness. The forest quiets down in layers. First the birds go, then the insects change pitch. The bigger things start moving, deer mostly and raccoons. Sometimes, if you sit real still, you can hear them breaking sticks or kicking stones. After cleaning up and making sure the food was hung away from camp, I climbed into my hammock with my headlamp on and a paperback I'd brought. I remember the sound of the nylon fabric as I shifted to get comfortable, the crinkle of the pages when I turned them. The fire had burned down to low coals, casting just enough light to see the shapes of nearby trees, but nothing more. My headlamp was in the low setting, just bright enough to read. The beam lit up the book and a few feet past my feet, leaving most of the woods around me in thick shadow. I don't know what made me look up. Maybe it was instinct, maybe something in my periphery, but I remember that moment clearly. My eyes moved from the page, my head turned slightly, and just on the edge of the beam, barely lit, just enough to know it wasn't a tree, I saw a man. He was standing still, facing me. At first I thought I was imagining it. You know how the eyes can play tricks on you when you're focused on something else. But I blinked, and he didn't disappear. He didn't move either, just stood there. It was too far to see his face clearly, but I could tell he was looking right at me. His body didn't sway or shift. He didn't fidget like a person normally would. He was too still. I froze, book in my lap, heart starting to pick up. I sat up in the hammock slowly, not tearing my eyes away, and shouted out, loud enough to startle anything nearby. But the man didn't react, didn't flinch, just stayed where he was, half in shadow, half in the dim glow of my headlamp's edge. I switched the lamp to high and aimed it straight at him. He was gone. The beam reached farther now, lit up the whole space where he had been. But there was nothing there. No man, no movement, no sound of footsteps. I scanned side to side, light shaking slightly in my hand, but the woods were empty again. At that moment, the feeling hit me, not just fear, but a kind of cold pressure in my chest. My body understood before my mind could catch up. Something was wrong. That wasn't just a mis-seen stump or a trick of the light. Someone had been watching me. I didn't yell again. I didn't wait. I snapped the book shut, grabbed the flashlight from my pocket, and started packing up fast. Every sound made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, like someone was still out there, just outside the reach of the light. I kept turning to look behind me, scanning with the beam, but there was never anything. My gear was scattered, stove still cooling, food bag tied up in a tree, my sleeping bag half inside the hammock. I didn't bother folding anything, just stuffed it into the pack. I left the food, left the fire. The only thing I made sure of was zipping my knife into my jacket pocket and double-checking that the batteries of my flashlight were fresh. I didn't want to hike out in the dark. The trail back wasn't hard, but it was narrow and winding, and some spots had drop-offs you could miss in low light. But staying there wasn't an option. Not after that. I slung the pack on and headed back the way I came. Light aimed low to catch the trail markers I'd noticed on the hike in. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen. Not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I had to. I thought I heard something once, about 100 yards off, like a dry stick breaking. But it didn't repeat, and I didn't wait for confirmation. I moved fast, quicker than I usually would with a full pack. I don't know how long it took, maybe a little over an hour, but by the time I saw the faint glint of moonlight reflecting off the metal trailhead sign, my legs were burning and my back was soaked with sweat. The parking area was empty, just my truck sitting under the trees. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, headlights off, trying to calm down. I didn't start the engine right away. I just listened, waiting to see if anything followed me out of the woods. But there was nothing. Eventually, I drove into town, got a room at a cheap roadside motel, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape standing in the woods, just barely inside the light. That stillness, that absence of any normal movement, the way he vanished when the light hit him full on. The next morning, after a hot shower and a weak cup of coffee from the motel lobby, I drove back up to the trailhead. I wanted to make sure I hadn't imagined it, that I hadn't dropped something important in my panic. The sky was bright and clear now, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes the forest feel safe again. But that feeling from the night before still stuck to me like a bad smell. I hiked back in about a mile, slower this time, scanning the woods carefully. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no broken branches. My food bag was still in the tree, untouched. Even the fire had burned itself out without spreading. The hammock was still there, half collapsed from how quickly I'd left it. I searched the area where the man had stood, looked for anything, a boot print, a piece of clothing, even just a sign that someone had passed through. But there was nothing. The pine needles lay undisturbed. No tracks, no crushed leaves, just open woods. It made no sense. I don't know how someone could have been there, that close, without leaving a trace. No matter how soft your footsteps are, you leave something behind in the woods, especially in that dry October layer of leaves. I didn't stay long, packed the rest of my gear, took one more look around, and hiked out. That was the last time I camped solo in Pisgah. It's been a few years now. I still think about it. Not every day, but enough. I try to rationalize it. Tell myself maybe it was just a hunter, some guy trying to scare me, or maybe even someone lost who got spooked when I shouted. But the way he stood there, the way he didn't move or react, the way he disappeared so fast, without a sound or sign, it didn't feel like someone lost. It felt like someone who knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. People always think of the woods as peaceful, maybe a little eerie at night, but mostly safe if you know what you're doing. But the truth is, you never really know who's out there. Not the animals, not the weather, the people, especially the ones who don't want to be seen. And when you're alone in the forest, away from cell service, away from help, the only thing standing between you and the dark is a few thin batteries and a zipper. You can't reason with silence. And you can't always explain what you saw. But I know what I saw, and I don't go back. We had been planning the Ozarks trip for a while. It was late September, that window of time when the heat dies down just enough for long sleeves at night, but the bugs aren't all gone yet. The leaves were just starting to shift to yellow and red in patches, and we wanted to get in one more camping weekend before everything turned cold and muddy. It was me, my friend Adam, and his cousin Chris. We kept it simple. Pack light. Just enough food for 3 days, sleeping bags, a cheap tent that leaked if the rain came straight down, and a water filter for the stream. We parked off an old forest road, hiked in a few miles, and found a spot that wasn't on any trail map. No real path, just a clearing with enough flat space to set up camp. The trees were dense, tall, and felt older than any forest I'd camped in before. It was dead, quiet up there, with that kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you're not. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. That wasn't new. Most of the time we didn't. It was just something we did, some mix of being private and thinking we were smart enough to handle ourselves. We figured cell service was spotty, but not totally dead, and we weren't planning to do anything dangerous. We just want a place to sit around a fire, cook some food, and be far from everything. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, made a small fire, cooked sausage and beans out of cans, and passed around a bottle. We talked about work, women, nothing serious. Around midnight, we put out the fire and got in the tent. It was cold enough that we zipped up tight, but not too bad. Sometime after I'd started to drift off, I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Above us. A scratching sound. Not like branches moving in the wind. There wasn't any wind. This was deliberate. Slow. Like something dragging metal across wood. I lay there with my eyes open in the dark, waiting for someone else to stir or say something, but nobody did. I didn't want to be the one to speak first and confirm that I wasn't imagining it. The noise kept going. Long, scraping sounds every few minutes. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Not an animal. I've heard raccoons, possums, even bears up in trees before. They scurry. They make a mess. This was slow, drawn out, too smooth. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to daylight. I didn't say anything to the others right away. Neither of them brought it up either. We ate instant oats and hiked a mile out to a ridge for a view. Spent the day walking the edge of the woods, talking about work and what we'd do for the winter. It was the kind of day that makes you forget the world exists. Sunlight pouring through the trees, everything golden and quiet. That second night, the sound came back. Same as before, long scraping. A couple times I swore I heard it directly above the tent, like something was moving from branch to branch. But again, no footsteps, no rustling. Just that slow, sickening sound of something metal being pulled across bark. I sat up this time, still didn't say anything. I was too aware that maybe I was letting my imagination get away with me. I waited to hear someone else move or react, but the others were either asleep or pretending to be. The sound kept coming on and off until well past midnight. When the sun came up, I got out of the tent first. Didn't bother boiling water or making breakfast. I went straight to the trees around our camp. I wanted to know what had been making that noise. It didn't take long. About 15 feet up on one of the thicker trees, an old white oak, there were marks. Not just scratches. Deep gashes, straight and narrow, about a foot long, in sets of 3. They were clean. Too clean to be claws or weather. They looked carved, like someone had dragged a knife or blade through the bark deliberately. I called the others over, and they looked up and didn't say much. Chris offered maybe it was some old marks from tree trimming or forest workers, but we all knew that didn't make sense. There weren't any signs of logging or anything else out here. No stumps, no clearings. We started walking tree to tree, and we found more. Every tree within about 30 yards of the tent had at least one of those same marks. Some higher up, some lower. All the same style, long, clean, carved deep like someone had pressed hard with a blade. No animal did this. And in some of the deeper ones, where the bark had been cut enough to show the pale wood underneath, we saw something else. Initials. Ours. Mine and Adam's, carved under one of the deeper gashes. The letters were small, neat, and fresh. No moss, no weathering. Whoever did it had done it recently, probably in the last couple days, probably while we were here. We stared at it in silence. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it, but we didn't need to. We hadn't told anyone where we were going, not even our girlfriends. We just loaded up and left. So who knew we'd be here? We didn't have answers. That whole day, we kept circling camp, trying to find footprints or signs that someone had come in after us. But the ground was dry and covered in leaves. If someone had come through, They didn't leave much behind. That afternoon, I decided to climb. I'm not great with heights, but the tree wasn't hard, big enough to get a good hold, and the branches weren't too far apart. I climbed up about 20 feet to the gash that had our initials under it. I pressed my fingers into it, ran my thumb along the edge. Still sharp, not even crusted over. I looked out from the branch and saw more of them, marks on trees deeper into the woods. They followed a pattern, not random, like a line or a boundary. Whatever it was, we were in the middle of it. I climbed down and told the others. We sat at the fire without lighting it, all three of us trying to act normal. But we weren't. We were scared, not panicking, but something in us had shifted. That deep, quiet fear that crawls under your skin when you realize someone's watching you and you don't know from where. We didn't sleep much that night. The scraping started up again. Same rhythm, same sound, maybe louder. None of us moved. Nobody got up to check. I lay on my back in the tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the slow, steady sound of metal on bark for hours. It would stop for long stretches, then start again. A few times it sounded like it circled us, always from the trees, never from the ground. When morning came, we made the decision without saying it. We packed. No breakfast, no talk. Just packed fast, looking over our shoulders, every sound in the trees making us jump. We took the long way back, avoiding the direction the gashes had been heading. We bushwhacked through thicker underbrush, moved fast. I didn't stop to rest once. When we got back to the car, we didn't speak. Just threw the packs in the trunk and got in. It wasn't until we hit the highway that anyone said a word. Chris asked if we were going to tell anyone. I said no. We all agreed. But it didn't stop there. About a week after we got home, I noticed something carved into the tree outside my apartment. I live on the second floor, but there's an old pine right outside my window. One morning, I saw it from the kitchen. I leaned out and looked closer. 3 long gashes cut in the same way. Clean, sharp. Beneath it, in smaller letters, were my initials. Again, just mine this time. I moved out the next week. I haven't been back in the woods since. Not really. Not overnight. I still hike, still walk trails during the day, but I don't stay past dark. I keep my phone on, share my location, and always tell people where I'm going now. I don't know who was out there with us. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe it was just a scare. Maybe it was someone messing with us. But it felt older than that. Not supernatural. Just deliberate. Cold. Human in the worst way. Someone knew where we were. Someone was close enough to watch. Someone marked our names into those trees. And I still don't know why. I've been planning that trip for a while. It was late September, and I'd finally carved out 4 days for a solo backpacking loop through a quieter stretch of the Bitterroots in western Montana. I'd done my research. The trail I picked wasn't heavily trafficked, but it was known for being scenic and reliable. No major water crossings, decent cell reception at the ridges, and a few small streams that usually ran steady even in the fall. I parked my truck at the trailhead, packed light, and stepped off under a pale blue sky. By the end of the first day, I covered about 12 miles, which was more than I originally planned, but the air was cool and dry, and I felt strong. I passed only one hiker early on, a guy in his 50s with a faded pack and a heavy beard. We nodded at each other, didn't speak. After that, it was just trees, chipmunks, and the dry whisper of wind through yellowing brush. Around 5:30 p.m., I found a spot to camp near a narrow stream, cutting through a dip in the land. It was just off the trail enough for some privacy, but not so far I get turned around finding it again. The stream was shallow, barely a few inches deep, with smooth round rocks and cold, clean water. I cleared a space for my small tent, laid out my pad and bag, and boiled some water for dinner, one of those freeze-dried pasta meals. It tasted like cardboard, but it filled my stomach and warmed me up. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the woods started to settle in that way they do. Everything gets quieter, even the wind. I moved around camp a little, tightening guy lines, putting my food in a dry bag to hang from a branch later, and sipping on the last of my tea. The smell of pine and cold earth settled around me. I hadn't seen anyone since morning. There weren't any footprints near this part of the trail, either. It felt isolated, which is what I'd wanted. Then I saw the light. I was standing near the edge of the stream, brushing my teeth, when I noticed a soft, flickering glow through the trees across the water. It was dim and orange, not white like a flashlight or blue like a phone screen. It looked like a lantern, the old fuel kind, just bobbing a little behind some dense underbrush, maybe 50 yards out, where the trees pressed close together and the slope climbed up slightly. My first reaction was confusion. There wasn't a trail that led in that direction, at least not one I'd seen, and the brush was thick enough that I couldn't imagine someone bushwhacking through it for no reason. I stood there, toothbrush in my mouth, staring at it. It wasn't moving fast, just kind of swaying like someone holding it and standing still, maybe shifting their weight. Then it was gone, just like that. I squinted, craned my neck to see if it was still there, but the orange light had disappeared. Nothing moved. No crackling of leaves or snap of twigs. Just the soft murmur of the stream. I stood there for a while, toothbrush in hand, heart starting to pick up its pace. I've done enough solo trips to know your mind can mess with you in the woods, especially at dusk. Light plays tricks. Eyes invent shapes. But this didn't feel like that. I wasn't tired. I hadn't had any alcohol. I was grounded and alert. And that light looked real. I finished brushing and spit into the stream. I told myself it was probably just another camper, maybe someone who had wandered off trail or was staying out of sight for privacy. Not everyone wants company. Still, something about it rubbed me wrong. Why no noise? Why no tent or signs of movement? I waited a few minutes, watching the trees where the light had been, but nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to finish my routine. I hung my food bag high and well away from camp. I double-checked the zippers on my tent. I lay down fully clothed except for my boots, which I kept just inside the door. I didn't sleep much that night. I laid on my side, ears tuned to every sound. The stream gurgled quietly, a calming but steady white noise. Every now and then I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle. Once I heard what might have been an owl in the distance. All normal things, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close, and maybe still was. A couple times I clicked on my headlamp and scanned outside through the mesh, sweeping it side to side slowly. Nothing, just shadows and trees. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps, just 2 or 3 quick ones like someone shifting weight on dry ground. They were faint, almost too faint to trust. Could have been a deer, I told myself. Could have been nothing. I held my breath and stayed still for a long time. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was light out. I stepped out of the tent into a gray, overcast morning. The stream was still flowing, birds were starting to chirp, and there was no sign of anyone. I walked to the spot where I thought I'd seen the light. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles and old leaves, and it took me a minute to find a path through the brush. It wasn't easy going. Thorns caught my sleeves, and some of the fallen logs were slick with moisture. But after a few minutes, I reached the place where I figured the light had been. There was nothing there. No footprints. No cleared spot. No gear or scraps. Nothing that said someone had stood there. But the weird thing was how dead quiet it was. No bird song, no wind, just a stillness that sat heavy in the trees. I stayed for less than a minute before heading back. I packed up fast that morning. I didn't feel like staying another night in that spot. Something in my gut told me to move. I knew there was a lake about 8 miles up the trail where people sometimes camped. I figured it'd be better to head there, maybe even see someone else along the way. As I hiked, I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't like how the trail twisted along the slope, giving plenty of blind corners and narrow switchbacks. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the trees, something dark slipping between trunks uphill from me. But when I stopped and stared, it was gone. By noon, I made it to the lake. It sat in a basin surrounded by granite and sparse pine. There were a couple fire rings and flat spots from past campers, and I felt better seeing signs of people. I didn't see anyone else, but knowing the place was used more often helped settle my nerves. I spent the rest of the day fishing and trying to relax. That night was better. I still slept light, but I didn't hear anything weird. No footsteps, no lights, just wind on the water and the creak of trees. The next day, I kept moving. My plan had been to make a loop, but I decided to cut it short and take the more direct trail back to the trailhead. I was still 2 days from home, and something about that first night had shaken my nerves more than I like to admit. I passed a ranger cabin that afternoon. It was empty, shuttered for the season, but there was a logbook nailed to the wall in a waterproof box. I signed in, wrote the date, and mentioned seeing a strange light near mile marker 12 the first night. I didn't write much, just enough in case someone else reported it later. When I finally made it back to the truck, it was late afternoon. The sun was behind the ridges again, painting the peaks in orange. I loaded my gear, checked my tires, and started driving the long dirt road back out to the highway. It wasn't until I was almost to cell range that I let myself think about it again in full. Someone had been out there. I believed that. The light was too steady, too real, to be a reflection or illusion. But why be off trail, silent, and gone so fast? Why no campsite? No fire, no signs of anything left behind. Maybe it was someone avoiding notice. Maybe it was just a hunter or a hermit or some local guy who knew the land better than I did. But there's something unsettling about knowing how easy it is to vanish into those woods. How someone could stand 50 yards from you, watching, and you'd never even know unless they wanted you to. I haven't been back to that part of the Bitterroot since. I still hike, still camp solo sometimes, but I trust my gut a little more now. I pick my campsites more carefully. I scan the woods a little longer before settling in. And I remember that light, faint, orange, steady, and how it disappeared like it was never there. It didn't follow me. Nothing happened after. No fairy tale ending. No big confrontation. Just the heavy feeling that someone had been near me, watching, and chose to stay hidden. And that's what still sticks with me. Not what I saw, but what I didn't. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted to get away from the noise, the traffic, the routines, and everything that came with being around too many people. I needed quiet, real quiet. The kind of silence you only find way out in the woods, away from cell service, away from light pollution, and away from all the comforts that make life soft. I settled on the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I'd read about the trails, the ridgelines, the thick pine forests, and the kind of solitude they offer. It was exactly what I was looking for. I picked a spot far from any official campsite, maybe 10 or 12 miles off the closest forest road. I hiked in with my pack loaded for a 3-day solo trip. I had all the usual stuff: tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, a headlamp, a small hatchet, and a knife I kept on me most of the time when I'm out in the backcountry. Nothing fancy, just what I needed. It was October, so the air was cool but not cold yet. The days were still warm enough to hike in a t-shirt, but the nights dropped fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. The first day went fine. I followed a game trail off the main hiking path and set up camp on a small flat spot between two gentle slopes. It was tucked away between pine and oak trees, with enough space for my tent and a place to sit and cook. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled clean, almost sweet from the trees and the dry leaves. I didn't see another person the whole day, and I liked that. No voices, no movement in the distance, no tire tracks or trash, just stillness and the kind of quiet that hums in your ears after a while. I ate early that evening, just a simple meal I cooked on my little stove, dehydrated beef stew, and some hot tea. I remember sitting there in my camp chair as the sun started to drop behind the ridge, watching the shadows stretch and the sky go from blue to gray. It got dark fast. That's the thing about being deep in the woods with no artificial light. Night comes like a curtain being pulled. 1 second you're in dim light, and the next you can't see your own hands without a headlamp. I zipped myself into the tent before it got too cold, pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin, and laid there listening. The forest was alive in a quiet way. Wind moving through the trees, small cracks of branches, maybe a squirrel or something else light-footed rummaging through the underbrush. Normal sounds you get used to and even start to enjoy once your brain stops trying to make everything into a threat. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I don't know what exactly woke me. Maybe it was just the kind of half sleep you get sometimes when you're on the ground and your body's not used to it. I laid there for a while, eyes open in the dark, listening to the wind. The forest had changed. There was no more rustling, no small sounds, no owls, just stillness. The kind that sits on your chest and makes your ears ring. I laid there, wide awake now, trying not to move too much. Then I heard it, breathing. Not mine, not some distant animal panting or snorting in a brush. This was close, right outside my tent. Long, slow inhales, a pause, then an exhale, deep and steady like something calm, like something confident. It wasn't frantic or fast, just steady breathing. I could hear it clearly through the thin nylon of my tent. It circled the tent slowly, moving from one side to the other, but what got me was how silent everything else was. No footsteps, no crunch of pine needles or leaves, no twigs snapping, just the breathing as if whatever was floated. I laid perfectly still. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I didn't grab my flashlight. I didn't reach for my knife. I didn't even blink. I just listened. I don't know how long it circled. 10 minutes? 20? It felt like hours. It would stop on one side of the tent, then move again, slowly to the back, then around again. I couldn't tell how tall it was or how close exactly, but it had to be just a foot or two from the fabric. I was afraid that if I moved or made a sound, it would know I was awake. I thought maybe it was a bear, but bears make noise. Even the quiet ones still step on twigs, still breathe faster, still grunt or huff. This wasn't like that. It was intentional, too quiet to be casual, too smooth. I told myself maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind and my half-awake brain were playing tricks on me. But no, the breathing was real. You don't mistake that kind of sound when it's that close. You feel it in your bones. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't hear it leave. I didn't hear branches shift or needles crunch. It was just gone, like a switch flipped. I laid there until morning. I didn't sleep another second. I watched the darkness fade through the mesh at the top of the tent and waited for the light to make things feel normal again. When it was finally light enough to see without a flashlight, I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped out. My legs were stiff from being in the same position for hours, and my hands were shaky. The woods looked normal, bright even. Sunlight slanted through the trees and caught on the dew clinging to the pine needles. Everything was still. I looked around slowly, checking for tracks for anything. There were none. The pine needles were thick around my tent, and they showed impressions easily, like when I walked over them. I could clearly see where my boots had been. But there were no other marks. No prints. No disturbed patches. Nothing that showed something or someone had circled me for what felt like half the night. I walked a wider circle around camp, just to be sure. Checked every angle, every possible approach. Still nothing. I even looked up into the trees for signs of broken branches or claw marks. Still nothing. It was as if the whole thing never happened, except for the memory of that breathing and the way it made my skin crawl. I packed up camp slowly. My plan had been to stay 2 more nights and explore deeper into the ridges. Maybe follow the creek I had crossed the day before, but I couldn't shake the feeling, that heavy feeling in my gut. It didn't feel like fear in the usual way. It felt like I had been sized up, like something out there had found me in the dark and watched me long enough to decide something. Maybe it lost interest. Maybe it wasn't ready. I don't know. I don't scare easily. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the woods, from Arizona to Maine, and I know the sounds of animals and the weird shaped shadows can make on a tired brain. But this was different. The quiet was too complete. The breathing was too real, too deliberate. The way it moved without making a single sound on that forest floor full of dry pine needles. That's the part one still think about. I hiked back to the trailhead that morning without stopping. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't make coffee. I didn't even take off my pack to rest. I just kept moving. My ears were tuned to every sound, every bird call, every twig snap in the distance. I kept looking over my shoulder without realizing it, half expecting to hear that breathing again, just behind the next tree or over my shoulder. When I finally reached my truck, I sat behind the wheel for a while before turning the key. The parking area was empty, and the engine sounded too loud when it roared to life. I sat there with my hands gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of it. Nothing followed me. Nothing left marks. Nothing showed itself. But something had been there. I know it. I felt it. I haven't been back to that part of the Ouachitas since. Not because I'm afraid exactly, but because I don't know what to look for. I don't know how to prepare for something that doesn't leave tracks, that doesn't breathe fast, that doesn't make a sound when it moves. I've camped since then, plenty of times, but I'm more cautious now. I choose my spots more carefully. I watch the forest a little longer before I settle in. I listen harder, and every now and then, when I wake up in the middle of the night and the woods are too quiet, I hold my breath and listen for that sound, that slow, steady breathing in the dark. And I wonder if it found someone else's tent, or if it's still out there, just waiting for the right kind of silence. I was camped out near the boundary of Yellowstone, tucked into a quiet spot off the main trail. It was the kind of place most tourists wouldn't bother to look at, not really near anything significant. The sun had set hours ago, and the night air was cool, but still, there was this thick, charged silence that I hadn't quite gotten used to. The kind of silence that lets you hear your own heartbeat. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. I had spent the afternoon hiking along a trail, and after a long day, I figured I would stay the night here. The spot seemed perfect, tucked between a few low trees with a good view of the stars. It was far enough from any campsites to feel isolated, but not too far from the trail to be unsafe. My tent was set up just a little off the beaten path, the smell of pine and earth filling the air as I settled in. By now, I was used to the basic routine of camping alone. I set up my tent, unpacked my sleeping bag, and got a fire going, but nature, of course, didn't care about my comfort. So, when nature called, I knew it was time to dig a cat hole, an essential part of any backcountry experience. I had dealt with the same thing countless times before on past trips, and Yellowstone wasn't any different in that respect. I grabbed my trowel, a lightweight, foldable one, and headed a little further away from my camp. I wanted to be well clear of the tent and the fire, especially since there were signs of bears nearby. I could hear the wind rustling the trees above me as I walked deeper into the forest. There was no one else around for miles, and the only sound was the soft crunch of dirt and dead leaves beneath my boots. I found a spot far enough off the trail and got to work. I dug and dug, my hands moving automatically as my mind wandered back to the hike. It had been a good day. The sun had dipped behind the mountains hours ago, and the night air was growing chillier with each passing minute. My breath came out in little clouds of condensation as I continued to dig, but after a few moments, something felt off. It wasn't the usual sensation of digging into soft dirt. At first, I thought I'd hit a rock or a large root. No big deal. I adjusted my grip on the trowel and tried to clear the area around whatever it was. But the next time my trowel hit it, the sound was different. It wasn't the dull thud of rock or wood. It was harder, almost hollow. I tried digging around it, brushing away the dirt, and that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a large, pale bone sticking out of the dirt. I blinked, and my heart skipped a beat. The bone was long, clean, it had a human shape to it. I paused. I ran my fingers lightly over it, feeling the cold smoothness. The bone was perfectly white, almost polished. It looked too clean, like it had been buried for a long time, but hadn't decayed the way bones usually do in the earth. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't look away. My eyes moved over the bone, and then I noticed more, small pieces of bone scattered around. A rib here, a fragment of something else there, half buried beneath the dirt. I swallowed, feeling that knot of unease tighten in my stomach. Something about the whole scene felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The thought hit me suddenly. What if this was part of something larger? What if there was more buried beneath the surface? What if there was a body here? The wind howled again through the trees, and for a brief moment, I swore I heard something else in the distance. A crack of a branch, maybe something that wasn't just the wind. I froze, gripping the trowel in my hand. My eyes scanned the darkness between the trees, but there was nothing, just a black night, stretching out in every direction. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. I stood up quickly, wiped my hands on my pants, and backed away from the hole. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't know what I'd found, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I refilled the hole, covering up the bones, covering up whatever it was that lay just below the surface. I didn't know if it was part of something criminal or just an unfortunate animal, but the thought of digging deeper made my skin crawl. I didn't even bother to check if I covered everything properly. My hand was shaking, my breath coming quicker now. I just walked away. I didn't even take a second glance at the place I'd just left behind. I moved a mile away from my original camp, deeper into the forest, until I found a spot I felt comfortable with. The air still felt charged, but at least it was quieter here. A little farther away from the boundary, and maybe a little farther from whatever it was I had just uncovered. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows through the trees. I lay in my tent, the ground beneath me feeling unnervingly cold, as if something had seeped through the earth to touch me. The silence outside was too heavy. It pressed in on me, reminding me of the bones I'd found, buried so long ago, untouched until I came along. I thought about calling it in, about letting someone know what I'd found, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was something in my gut that told me not to. Something that told me I shouldn't have been there, shouldn't have found that place. I didn't want to know the truth behind those bones. I didn't want to know if they belonged to someone who had gotten lost, or worse, if they had been hidden there for some other reason. And so I didn't. I stayed quiet. But even as I lay there, listening to the wind whip through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods felt too still, too empty. It was as if they were waiting for something. And I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, as if something had noticed my presence and was now keeping track of me, knowing I had uncovered something that should have stayed buried. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless thoughts and unease. At first light, I packed up my camp and got out of there. I didn't want to be anywhere near that spot again, and I didn't want to stay in Yellowstone any longer. It was too quiet, too strange. I knew I had to leave. I still think about it sometimes. That night, those bones. I wonder if someone else will find them someday. Maybe after I've long gone. I wonder if someone will dig down into the earth and uncover the same feeling of wrongness I had. Or maybe it'll be a long time before anyone else sets foot in that spot. Maybe the bones will stay hidden, buried where no one can touch them. I wish I had called it in. I wish I had been brave enough to tell someone. But in the end, I didn't. And for whatever reason, I think that was the right decision. There's a certain peace in letting things be, even if you don't understand them. Maybe it wasn't my place to know the truth. Maybe some things are better left buried. Still, every now and then, I think about that feeling I had being watched. It's not a thought I can shake off easily. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still feel it. The deep, oppressive silence. The eerie stillness that seems to cling to the trees. Maybe I'm just paranoid, or maybe something knows I was there. Something knows what I found. And whatever it is, it doesn't want me to forget. It was late September when a group of us decided to head into a remote part of Idaho for a weekend camping trip. The plan was simple: get away from everything. No phones, no work, no noise. Just a few friends, some beer, and a fire under the stars. We were all in our late 20s, outdoorsy enough to handle ourselves, but not survivalists or anything. We picked a place deep in the woods, miles off the main road. No cell service, barely a trail leading in. The kind of place where you can scream and no one would hear you. That was the appeal at the time. There were 5 of us in total. We got there early in the afternoon, parked the trucks where the dirt path ended, and hiked the rest of the way in with our gear. We set up near a stream, surrounded by dense trees and thick undergrowth. It was a pretty spot, quiet except for the water and the occasional bird call. We pitched our tents in a half circle, got a fire going, and spent the evening drinking and laughing. The air was getting cold as the sun dipped, so we stayed close to the fire, bundled up in flannels and jackets, cooking hot dogs and roasting marshmallows like kids. We talked late into the night. The stars were out, and the moon was just a sliver, enough to cast a faint silver light on the tops of the trees. Eventually, one by one, people started turning in. By around 1 a.m., it was just me and one other guy left, still poking at the fire and finishing off a last beer. I didn't feel tired, not really. I felt relaxed, like I could stay up all night just listening to the fire crackle. But I figured I should at least try to get some sleep, so I said goodnight and crawled into my tent. I lay there for a while, warm in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind in the trees and the stream nearby. It was peaceful, real peace, not the kind you get in town when things go quiet, but the kind that feels ancient, like you're part of something bigger than yourself. It made me feel small in a good way. I must have been lying there for about half an hour when I realized I had to pee. I didn't want to get up. It was cold and my sleeping bag was warm, but the feeling wasn't going away. So I unzipped my bag, put on my boots without lacing them, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Everyone else's tents were zipped up. No movement, no sound except the breeze and the soft trickle of water. I didn't bother going far. I just walked maybe 30 feet away from camp toward a cluster of bushes near a tree line, enough to be out of sight. As I stood there, I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the dark. I could see outlines well enough, the tree trunks, the slope of the ground, my breath hanging in the air. It was one of those quiet nights where the silence feels heavy. I didn't even hear crickets. I just finished and was about to head back when I heard it. My name, clear as day, from the trees ahead of me. At first, I thought it was one of the guys messing with me. Just a low voice, almost a whisper, coming from deeper in the woods. But something was wrong. It wasn't just that the voice came from the dark. It was the way it sounded. It sounded like me. I froze. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. The same tone, the same pace I used when I talked. Like someone had taken a recording of me, saying my own name, and played it back. I stood there completely still, my breath caught in my throat. I listened hard, trying to hear anything else. Footsteps, breathing, movement. Nothing. Just that silence again, thick and unnatural. Then it called again. Same voice. Same exact tone. My name, drawn out just a little longer than normal, like it was testing it. Mocking it. Trying on like a piece of clothing. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but all I could see were trunks and branches. No movement. No eyes shining back at me. Just forest. My stomach dropped. Every instinct I had screamed to run to get back to camp, but I couldn't move at first. I felt like my legs were frozen. I remember the weight of the flashlight in my hand, the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I finally forced myself to back away, step by step, not taking the light off the woods. I didn't look behind me. I just moved, quietly at first, then faster, almost stumbling over the uneven ground. I got back to my tent and zipped it shut without turning the light off. I lay down on my bag, boots still on, heart racing. I didn't sleep. I listened. For hours. Every little rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me hold my breath. I kept trying to convince myself it had been one of the guys screwing around. But deep down I knew it wasn't. None of them had my voice. None of them could have made it sound that exact. And even if they had a recording or something, why? Why wait until I was alone in the dark, far from the fire, to use it? I didn't say anything in the morning. We all woke up slow, groggy, hungover. I made coffee and kept glancing toward the trees where I'd heard it. The place didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watched. When everyone was packed up and ready to hike out, I looked back once. Just a glance. Nothing was there. Just woods. But something had been. I was sure of it. It's been a while since that trip, and I still don't talk about it much. It sounds crazy when I say it out loud, hearing my own voice out there calling to me from the trees. But I know what I heard. I know what it wasn't. It wasn't one of my friends. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It wasn't an animal. I don't know what it was, but it knew my name. It knew my voice. And it waited until I was alone. That trip changed how I see the woods. I still go camping sometimes, but not like before. Not that far out. Not that deep. Not where no one can hear you. There's something out there in the quiet, and it listens.